It's the middle of the night in Mohe, China's northernmost town, on January 22nd, 2023, and the thermometer has just settled on minus 53 degrees Celsius. That's not a typo, and it's not a one-off cold snap. The region had already been sitting below minus 50 for 3 straight days, roughly 20 degrees colder than even this place considers normal. There is no central heating grid out here. There is no gas line. There is no space heater plugged into a wall, because for most of the history we're about to walk through, there was no wall with a plug in it. Step outside unprepared at that temperature, and exposed skin can start freezing in minutes. Metal left, sitting in the open will take skin off your hand the way a hot stove would, just from the opposite direction. People didn't just grit their teeth through this. They built entire lives here, permanent villages, seasonal hunting camps, whole regional economies for centuries without a single one of the things you're picturing right now when someone says heating. Say ancient Chinese survival, and your brain probably jumps to the Great Wall, silk robes, and dynasty brochure imagery of the Yellow River heartland. None of that is who actually lived on this frozen frontier. The people native to it weren't Han dynastic China at all. And understanding who they actually were is where this gets interesting. Han settlement of this region, in any real numbers, comes centuries later than everything you're about to hear about. For most of the timeline that made this place livable, the people doing the actual engineering were somebody else entirely. Here's what I want you to sit with. We treat no heating like it obviously means no heat, like the only options are suffer or invent electricity. That assumption is wrong, and it's wrong in a specific, useful way. So today, we're going through all of it. Two completely different winter wardrobes made from two of the strangest raw materials you'll hear about this year. A heating system built directly into the architecture, a tent that swaps its own skin twice a year, a way of turning the cold itself into a pantry, and a penal colony that proves exactly what happens to people dropped into this climate without any of it. And by the end, you're going to land on something a little uncomfortable. This wasn't a story about toughness. It was a story about information and what happens to a culture the moment that information stops getting passed down. Here's the misconception baked into the question. We picture people out here surviving the cold the way you'd survive a car crash, grimly, temporarily, waiting for it to end. That's not what happened. The Oroshan, hunters of the Greater and Lesser Khingan mountain forests, the Hejin, fishing people of the Amur and Ussuri river system, and today, China's smallest ethnic minority, and the Jurchen, the Tungusic, hunting and herding people who would eventually build the Qing dynasty that conquered China itself, didn't treat 50 below as an emergency. They treated it as a design constraint they'd already solved generations before anyone wrote it down. Every piece of it, what you wore, what your house did while you slept in it, what shape your shelter took depending on the season, what you ate in February, had been quietly engineered around one specific problem for longer than most written history has existed. Not every group solved it identically either. Two peoples living the same latitude, the same brutal winters, sometimes reached completely different answers. And that gap between solved and not solved is going to matter a lot more later in this video than it seems right now. To understand how, we need the boring part first. What cold actually does to a body. You generate heat constantly just by being alive. Your muscles, your metabolism, your blood moving. The problem is you're also losing it 3 ways at once. Radiating it straight off your skin into the air, losing it to any air or wind moving across you, and losing it to anything cold you're directly touching, which is why sitting on frozen ground kills faster than standing in frozen air. Your body's response is to pull blood away from your hands, feet, ears, and nose first, protecting your core at the expense of your extremities, which is exactly why frostbite starts at the fingertips and not the chest. So the entire survival problem out here reduces to 3 moves. Stop the heat your body already makes from escaping, make more of it without burning through fuel that doesn't exist in a treeless winter forest, and keep yourself fed through 8 months where nothing grows and nothing moves. Everything that follows is just increasingly specific answers to those 3 questions. Move 1. Two peoples, one problem, not a single shared material. Start with clothing because this is where ancient Chinese winter gear stops meaning what you'd assume. Along the Amur and Ussuri rivers lived the Heijin, and their winter robes over trousers and boots weren't wool, weren't fur, weren't cotton. They were fish skin. Cold water river fish, and skinned, dried, hammered, and tanned through a multi-stage process until the material stopped behaving like fish and started behaving like leather. Waterproof, wear-resistant, light enough to actually hunt in. Good enough that the craft made it onto China's very first National Intangible Cultural Heritage list in 2006. And the detail that sounds made up but isn't. The thread holding those robes together was also fish. Bighead carp skin cut into thread, softened with liver oil, pulled from an entirely different fish. They built houses and boats out of the same material too, which is how they earned the name history remembers them by the fish skin tribe. Not a nickname, a description of an entire supply chain run out of one river with no sheep or loom or cotton field anywhere in it. Now move inland into the Khingan forests and you meet the Orokian solving the identical problem with the opposite material. No river to draw from out here, just forest, snow, and whatever the hunt handed you. Their winter parkas and boots were roe deerskin, chosen specifically because it held body heat better than nearly anything else they could get their hands on. Same region, same latitude, same weather trying to kill both groups at once, and neither one borrowed the other's answer, because neither one had access to it. You can't tan fish skin without a river running with fish. You can't hunt roe deer out of a river. Think about what that means logistically, not just symbolically. A Heijin robe needed a river full of fish, patience, and a tanning process measured in days. An Orokin parka needed a forest full of roe deer, a successful hunt, and a completely different kind of patience. Neither group could have shortcut its way into the other's system even if it had wanted to. The environment handed each people a different toolbox, and each people built its entire winter around exactly what was in that toolbox and nothing else. That's not a coincidence you can shrug off. When two neighboring peoples solve the exact same problem two completely different ways, and both solutions hold for generations. That's not luck. That's two independent engineering traditions, arrived at from opposite directions with opposite raw materials, both landing on, yes, this actually works. But clothing was only ever the plan for the walk between two warm places. What happened once you got indoors is doing more of the actual work than you'd guess. Move 2. A heating system built into the house itself. Here's the assumption sitting inside the video's own title. No heating means no heat, full stop, people just endured it. That's not what they built. What they built was a house that heated itself using a fire they were already lighting for a completely different reason. It's called the Kang, Nahan, in the Manchu language, a raised platform of brick or fired clay, often 2 meters or longer, taking up a third to half of a room's floor, not a bench. This was where the family slept, ate, worked, and spent most of a winter because it was simply the warmest surface in the building. Here's the actual mechanism. The same fire-cooking dinner in the adjoining kitchen didn't just vent up and out, wasted into the night. Its exhaust got routed through an internal flue system running directly under the sleeping platform before finally escaping through a chimney. The heat you were already producing to make food got a second job, heating the exact spot where you lived through the coldest hours of the day. One fire, 2 functions, not a single extra stick of fuel spent. And the underlying physics is functionally the same trick the Romans used in their hypocaust floors, arrived at completely independently, with zero contact between the two civilizations. This wasn't some last-minute fix once things got desperate either. Archaeological evidence for this kind of heat recycling floor in the region goes back roughly 7,200 years. Long enough that the Kang wasn't playing catch-up on heating technology. It was quietly ahead of most of what people picture when they hear the word ancient. A real excavated example, an L-shaped flue built from adobe and cobblestone, was found in Heilongjiang itself, dated to the 1st century CE, with more advanced double flue versions turning up in neighboring Jilin by the 4th century. And it wasn't only warm, it was social. The Kang was the one reliably warm surface in the entire house, so it became the place where everything happened. Meals eaten sitting on it, tools mended sitting on it, children raised sitting on it. Through months where stepping outside too long was genuinely dangerous. Translate that into modern terms. Imagine if your stove and your bed shared one utility bill and neither one ever needed to know the other existed. That's the Kang. And it isn't a museum piece. It's still called Nahan and still heating homes in villages across the region right now, which means this heating system has now outlasted the empire that eventually built its capital cities around it. But the house only covers you while you're standing still. Step outside the walls and the plan changes completely. Move 3. The tent that changes its coat with the seasons. The Orokin didn't only wear deerskin. Part of the year, they lived inside it. Their traditional shelter, the Jianrenju, was a cone-shaped frame roughly 6 meters across and 5 meters tall, with a single fire at the center doing 3 jobs at once. Cooking, warmth, light, all from one flame. Same efficiency instinct as the Kang, just portable this time, built for people who moved with the game instead of staying put. The covering is the actual trick. Summer, the frame got wrapped in birch bark, light, breathable, easy to pack and carry, while following animals through the forest. The moment real winter arrived, the bark came off and deerskin went up in its place because bark does nothing for you at 50 below and everyone out there already knew it. There's something almost stubborn about that design choice if you sit with it. They could have simply built 2 separate types of shelter and hauled around whichever one the season demanded. Instead, they kept one frame, one fire, one footprint on the ground all year and changed only the single layer that actually mattered. Less material to carry, less to rebuild from nothing. A structure that goes from mobile summer camp to storm-proof winter shelter without cutting a single new pole. Hold on to that idea. A system that only works if you read the season correctly and switch the layer at exactly the right moment. It's coming back later, and it doesn't end well for the people who missed that window. Move 4. Turning the killer into the pantry. Food worked on the same instinct. Make the environment do your work instead of fighting it for 8 straight months. Families traditionally slaughtered pigs right before the new year and packed the meat into jars of salt to last the year ahead. Hunted game got hung out in the open wind to air dry into strips a hunter could carry for days in the field without it spoiling. Clever, but not the part that should surprise you. The real trick is almost embarrassingly simple once you hear it. The same air that could freeze exposed skin in minutes was also, functionally, a free industrial freezer running at full capacity for months at zero cost. Frozen tofu, frozen pears, no mechanical refrigeration, no insulated box, no imported technology required. Just a winter that reliably sat at minus 20 degrees Celsius or colder for months at a stretch. And food set outside specifically to let that cold do the preserving for free. The exact force trying to kill you all winter was quietly also the thing keeping your dinner from spoiling. You do not waste a resource that powerful just because it's also dangerous. You put it to work like anything else in the house. If you'd told a Heijin or Oroken household in the middle of a real winter that people centuries later would pay a monthly bill for an appliance that did exactly what their own front step did for nothing, they probably wouldn't have understood the question. Every system so far is a story about people bending the cold to their advantage. That's not the whole story, because sometimes, for the wrong person, it didn't work at all. The part that turns the story over, Ninguta. During the Qing dynasty, Ninguta, in what's now southeastern Heilongjiang, was one of the empire's primary penal colonies. Over 1.5 million people across the dynasty formally sentenced to exile there for serious crimes. And exile to Ninguta was widely considered worse than execution. Not only because of forced labor under local garrison households who held near total power over an exile's life. These were military households the Qing had planted in the region generations earlier specifically to hold the frontier. And by the time exiles started arriving, They'd accumulated enough local authority that a newcomer's day-to-day survival depended entirely on their goodwill. But because of the climate itself, one exiled poet, writing from first-hand experience, described violent windstorms tearing through from early spring to mid-April, near constant rain, May through July, heavy snowfall by mid-August, and rivers frozen solid again by early September. Do that math. A genuinely livable window measured in weeks, not months, for people who, unlike the Orokin or Heijin or Manchu, arrived with none of the generations' deep knowledge that had kept families alive in this exact climate for centuries. It wasn't only the weather working against a new arrival either. It was weather, plus total isolation, plus total dependence on people who had no particular reason to make any of it easier. Sit with that contrast because it's the whole video compressed into one place. The identical cold that the Orokin, the Heijin, and the Manchu had built an entire engineered life around. The fish skin robes, the heat recycling floor, the tent that changed its coat on schedule, the wind turned into a freezer, was, for someone dropped into it without any of that inherited knowledge, a punishment worse than death. Same weather, two entirely different outcomes. That's not a coincidence. And it's not really about the cold at all. It's about the gap between knowing exactly what to do at 50 below and not knowing. Every one of the systems covered so far in this video looks effortless, almost obvious, once someone explains it to you in 2 minutes. Ninguta is the reminder that none of it was ever obvious in the moment. It was hard-won, tested against real winners by real people, over a timescale long enough to make it look inevitable in hindsight. And that gap didn't stay safely back in dynastic history. It kept closing in on people a lot more recently than you'd expect. What actually ended it? And it wasn't the winter. The Orokin kept living this way, hunting, moving with the herds, building Jianrenju tents, wearing roe deer skin against 50 below winters. Well into the 20th century. The cold never beat them. It hadn't managed to in centuries. In 1895, there were over 18,000 Orokin. By 1915, that number had already fallen to around 4,000. By 1945, after occupation-era policies forced Orokin hunters to work for rations that weren't enough to actually live on, fewer than 1,000 remained. Deaths from starvation and exposure that were imposed on them, not a failure of anything they'd engineered over the previous several centuries. Later settlement policy moved most remaining Orokin off the land into farming villages, and eventually hunting itself was banned outright. By recent counts, only about 12 traditional Orokin hunters are still living that way, and researchers estimate more than 90% of Orokin under 50 can no longer speak their own language. A language that was never written down to begin with, and now survives almost nowhere except in the memory of people older than that. Sit with that number for a second. 12, not 12,000. 12 people carrying forward a set of skills that once kept an entire people alive through weather that is, to this day, the coldest on the continent. Every system in this video, then the tent, the clothing, the recycled fire, the wind turned into a freezer, lived primarily in hands and memory, passed down by doing it alongside someone older, never by reading it anywhere. That's a fragile way to carry 7,000 years of engineering forward, and it very nearly didn't survive the 20th century intact. A culture that engineered its way through 8-month, 50 below winters for longer than most modern countries have existed was not taken down by the weather. It was taken down by everything that came after it. Here's what I keep coming back to. There's a house in Heilongjiang tonight. A brick platform under the floor, still warm from tonight's dinner fire, radiating heat up into a room where 3 generations are sitting on it at once. A tent frame, somewhere in the Kingen forest that will get its deerskin coat again the moment the first real frost hits. The same frame it wore last winter and the winter before that. A jar of frozen pears sitting outside a door doing the work a freezer does, for free, no compressor, no dial, no bill. None of it requires electricity. None of it has ever had an off switch because none of it ever needed an on switch. It was arrived at not by genius, but by generations of people paying close attention to what kept a body alive through February, and passing that on to the next person old enough to be trusted with it. And in January 2023, Mohe broke its own cold record again. Minus 53 degrees Celsius, the coldest ever logged on Chinese soil, roughly 20 degrees below normal even for a place that already calls itself China's North Pole. The Kong is still heating homes tonight. The frozen food trick still works exactly the way it did 1,000 years ago. The cold never went anywhere. What got harder and harder to find, generation by generation, were the people who still knew exactly how to answer it. So, no, surviving 50 below in ancient China was never the Great Wall. And it was never dynasty brochure China at all. It was fish skin robes sewn with fish skin thread, a heated floor running off dinner's leftover fire, a tent that swapped its coat with the seasons, food preserved by the very cold trying to kill it. None of that was luck. It was information held onto tightly enough, for long enough, that it looked like magic by the time anyone outside got to see it. The weather is still exactly where it always was. Most of the people who used to know how to answer it back aren't. Could you have made it through a winter out here? No fridge, no furnace, a tent that lives or dies by whether you swapped its coat on time. Let me know in the comments. Until then, stay warm.